Welcome aboard, everyone. My name is Ojas Nisalkar. I'm a part of the R&D department here at the Earth Appreciation Society. To start with, there's a quote which says, "It is not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent ones, but the one which is the most adaptable to change." Quoted by Charles Darwin, basically talks about the survival of the fittest. In today's world, the term sustainability is under limelight and of enormous importance. From cities like Singapore to Zurich making themselves more sustainable to having a specific unit to measure sustainability, which is the SDEO. In this discussion, let us understand how can sustainability be implemented in wildlife conservation in the view of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So I please now request Mr. Saurav and Trisha to join us. Come on in, guys. Let's just start talking.
Hi, Ojas. Thank you for having us here, and it's such a pleasure to talk to all of you.
It's
Hi
an
guys.
incredible pleasure to
Yeah.
have you guys. So now that we have like started rolling out, I'll just shoot my first question to you guys. We as students are curious to know how the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals fit into the realm of wildlife conservation. Like we would like you to just decode it for us. We can start with Saurabh first. Yes,
Sure.
Saurabh.
So, sure. Hi, and thanks everyone for putting this together. Thanks for the invitation, and I think it's great. And we need more and more universities and educational institutes in India to be doing things like this, even for students who are not directly studying the environment or ecology. And I think some of the questions or some of the points that you've just mentioned now or just are pertinent, but I think it is important for us to take a bit of a backseat to understand why the sustainable development goals were created in the first place and how they are important, and at the same time try to not being bound by these goals and look beyond these goals to create programs that are effective. So I'll just talk about, I think, some of the main problems that have been challenging India and the region lately and why these goals become important. So if we're talking about wildlife conservation, I think the most important thing is to look at habitats, right? And the reason that wildlife conservation is becoming more and more important is that habitats are being destroyed and there is illegal crimes that affect wildlife populations, and Trisha will be talking about that a bit more in details. And habitats are under stress because we have a huge rural population. In some parts of India, like the northeast of India, where my work largely focuses, in fact, our rural population is over 70%. And these rural populations are dependent entirely on land for their livelihoods, entirely on agriculture or directly on the forest for their livelihoods. Because of deforestation that has happened because of multitudes of reasons in these areas, we've lost forests. And because we've lost forests, that has affected land, that has affected agriculture, that has affected the productivity of land, and therefore people's incomes have gone down. And because people's incomes have gone down, the easiest way to have cash is to go and chop a tree from a forest. And therefore, further deforestation is happening. So, what we've actually gotten ourselves into is a really vicious cycle by which no forests are leading to reduced incomes, are leading to further forests being chopped off. So, in light of this, when you plan any sort of conservation program, whether it is for wildlife or habitats or multiple species and holistic interventions, it is important to look at what sort of pathways do we operate on. So the prime trigger, I would say, for a lot of the problems that nature faces in India is in fact poverty. Therefore, any problem that addresses or any solution that wants to try to address conservation issues in India has to tackle poverty, and therefore the number one SDG. In fact, a lot of my work is to do with building economic mobility for indigenous communities so that economic upliftment through nature-based restoration solutions in fact act as a trigger for further conservation work. And also, if we come to SDGs, say on hunger, I think hunger is very intimately linked to poverty in India. And in fact, a lot of the ills and a lot of the facts a lot of the reasons why we need the SDGs in India are in fact linked to issues of poverty and the lack of livelihoods. So creating livelihoods for people by restoring nature and through nature restoration, in fact, attack multiple of the SDGs and help us achieve multiple SDGs. So I think that the goal here is to create holistic programs that solve particular problems that regions face. And I think I'd like to hand over here to Trisha to talk to us about some of the SDGs that she tackles better and more holistically, and then we will take it from there.
Thanks, sir. So yeah, just building upon what Saurav said, it's so important for us to not look at the SDGs as little vacuums, but rather the interconnectedness between each of them. If we're talking about life on land or life underwater, simply look back to the fact that in India itself, we have about 275 million people that are forest dependent for their livelihoods. We have another 14.5 million people who are part of the fishing community. So their livelihoods are directly linked into how strong our ecosystems are. Now, Saurav's covered the whole how poverty and livelihoods are connected into wildlife conservation very well. I just want to take the conversation a little bit to health and well-being. As we all know, we are still suffering, reeling from the pandemic we just faced, and we're far from actually being through it. But Ojas, if we can also have you be part of this conversation as our moderator, yeah? Are you here with us?
I am absolutely there with you, Trisha.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Ojas, have you heard of zoonotic diseases?
I haven't. Could you just go just take us through it?
Let's first tackle what exactly is a zoonotic disease. Right now, we're all in the midst of coronavirus. Coronavirus is, in fact, a zoonotic disease. A zoonotic disease is any disease that's passed on from wildlife or animals to human beings. Um, while we all know about coronavirus, what we may not be as aware of is that in the last 60 years, we've had 435 zoonotic diseases. That is an amazing, mind-boggling number. So we did have warning signs for over the last, half a decade. Half a century. We've had warning signs of what was to come, and 60 to 65% of these zoonotic diseases were all linked back to land use change, which was bringing humans and wildlife closer and closer together. So that's one part, linking back to what Saurav said. Poverty, deforestation also affects our health because we're getting closer in contact with wildlife, leading to more and more zoonosis. Taking particularly the example of coronavirus. So Ojas, we all have heard of coronavirus. We've all done a lot of reading. Where did it originate?
As they say, the country of China.
Yeah. So we can say with some level of certainty that the coronavirus came out of the wet markets in Wuhan. What many people may not understand is what exactly is a wet market and why it's so detrimental. It's connected into the illegal wildlife trade, and the illegal wildlife trade is perhaps one of the largest illegal professions in the world. It's valued at about $20 billion annually. In the illegal wildlife trade, you have people picking up exotic wildlife from all parts of the world and putting them in very close proximity to one another in these wet markets where they're available for sale and for consumption. So in a natural habitat, most wildlife is carrying mild forms of viruses which are contained within the habitat. They don't fall sick from these viruses, and most of them are immune to the viruses. Now imagine you put a whole bunch of wildlife that are carrying mild forms of viruses into a little contained unit, which is your wet market. Add unhygienic and unsanitary conditions. The animals are stressed, the viruses are now intermingling with one another, and that creates perhaps the perfect situation for zoonosis to be born. And that's really the problem. So it's not the bat, it's not the pangolin, as we've heard. Moreover, it's that we're bringing all of this exotic wildlife and stuffing it into perhaps the worst possible conditions and the worst possible situations, which are giving rise to pandemics, giving rise to zoonosis more and more every day. Now, hearing all of this, a lot of people are like, okay, now wildlife is bad, biodiversity is bad. Why should we protect it? We must also remember that 50% of modern medicine is all derived from natural products. So when we're losing our forests, when we're losing our biodiversity, we're also losing the potential to create a lot of medicines that could save lives.
Yeah.
Again, so intrinsically linked to our health and well-being. Now let's focus more on the term well-being. So what do we need for our well-being? We need clean air, we need clean water, we need basic amenities, all of which are provided to us by our environment and by our ecosystems. And well-functioning ecosystems are absolutely essential to our well-being. I'm just going to go into my favorite habitat to talk about because I feel like it's one that we don't talk enough about and not enough people know about it, which is our marine biodiversity, our marine ecosystems, and our oceans. Few people may know that our marine ecosystems are the most intensive carbon sink that we have on the planet. And they can actually sequester carbon 50 times faster than a tropical forest of the same size. We, we just don't appreciate this fact. Also, 50% of the oxygen on the planet comes from our oceans. 80% of all recorded life on Earth lives in our oceans. Yet we've only explored about 10% of our entire oceans. It's quite amazing. Again, we have our livelihoods that are linked to our oceans because we have huge amounts of fishing communities, food source linked to our oceans because we need, many coastal communities are consuming fish and are reliant on fish. Then we need our clean air, we need our carbon sequestering for climate change mitigation. So in these ways, similarly to the oceans, your rainforests, your mangroves, every single habitat, every single ecosystem on the planet is very, very intrinsically linked to every SDG. You can't look at SDGs as 1, 2, 3, 4. You have to look at them as interconnected and holistic frameworks for sustainable progress. And I think that's the most important thing to remember when you're talking about SDGs or when you're planning anything. Saurav, I'm sure you have a lot to add at this point.
I think just to take it from there, Trishan, I think thanks for talking about carbon sinks in the oceans. I don't think many of us, including myself, think about that very much because we're so engrossed with the forest. But I think when you look at a problem from its root, and when you try and develop models and visions that tackle problems on a needs basis rather than on an ad hoc basis from a program to a program, you end up creating solutions that are holistic in nature, right? So if you look at why deforestation happens, you understand that there is no way to fix deforestation, like I mentioned earlier, without creating economic possibilities, right? And I had talked about then, therefore, trying to reduce poverty. And by reducing poverty, you automatically reduce hunger in most of the parts of the world that we're talking about. But not only that, if you're creating new pathways to employment, if you're creating new pathways to employment through ecosystem restoration, you then have the potential to build systems for work and economic growth that are good and decent. So now talking about the eighth SDG, for example, right? Because now it is in your hand to create this new model for employment, to create this new model for how our community is supposed to earn money from a forest. How do communities earn money by building a forest? How do communities earn money by maintaining a forest? And how do communities then earn money by harvesting from a forest, right? And I think one of the SDGs that I find very important, and I feel that that's an SDG that we actually don't know enough in the Western world, but are rather learning from indigenous communities, is the whole idea of gender equality, right? So when you talk about gender equality, it is something which is currently at an all-time low at with our indigenous communities, but it is also something that in fact probably began with indigenous communities, right? So if you look at the history of many of the communities in the northeast of India, gender equity was never a problem. But it is a problem that is increasing now because of the homogenization of our country and because of the homogenization of the world. And also because of, I think, many of the ills, Trisha, you would agree, that colonialism brought upon us, right? So in fact, not a lot of these SDGs are new, but all of it in a way gives you a holistic framework for growth But as one of my colleagues in fact pointed out today when we were chatting about SDGs, is that they're not really tuned to be good for ecology always, right? So a lot of the SDGs are in fact creating this vision of the world that is great for the West and great for urban areas, but not so great for rural areas. So I think it is not so important to be driven by the SDGs, but it is rather important to look at conservation, wildlife conservation, forest conservation from a holistic view and trying to solve the problems that actually cause these problems. Yeah.
The thing here is what Trisha highlighted about these points being these SDGs being interconnected and interlinked. Um, I personally, when I was looking forward to giving out, moderating you guys, I was like trying to understand every SDG and I was trying to connect it with wildlife conservation. But now the way you guys have decoded it for us, it has become way more easier. So that gets me to my next question. As they say, too many cooks spoil the broth, and yet when it comes to conservation or communities, their contribution has been exceptional. So how is it the matrix of such program that you decide upon, and how how do you measure the success of one particular project? How do you go about it?
So I think I will start answering that, and for that I'll have to be able
Yeah,
to
yeah,
share my screen. Yeah, I'm just going to share my screen. I know that Sunaina mentioned that it'll be nice if we can be seen through most of the program, but I guess I'll have to switch to PowerPoint for a while. Yeah. So is the screen visible to all of you?
it
Yes.
is. It is visible.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So essentially, I think talking about this, I will in a way brush upon some of the things that we talked about in the earlier question. But if you begin again by understanding what is the cause of the problem, right? So I'm just going to try to lay that out here for you. So if you look at the first point here, so about like a lot of deforestation analyses, in fact, suggest, and this is the birth of the innovation that I work with and the rationale behind why such a model had to be created, right? So about 10% of forest cover has been lost in the entire Eastern Himalayan belt since the year 2000. And when I talk about the Eastern Himalayan belt, it includes Nepal, Northeast India, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. So in the last 20 years, we have lost forests the size of Bhutan and Sikkim put together, which is an enormous amount. About 80% of the people that live in this area are dependent on industries or are employed in industries that directly depend on nature, and these are agriculture or forestry. Almost all of these people are also smallholder farmers, and about 50% of them face poverty. So what is happening is that poor rural incomes are forcing communities to exploit forests to create additional revenue so they can access basic things in life like healthcare, education, and food, right? Which are all basic assets. And the low incomes and degraded habitats of communities are in fact resulting in communities adaptability to climate change, are lowering communities' capabilities to adapt to floods, to adapt to global warming, and therefore, as a result, agricultural outputs are going right, and this entire region is defined by the forests. All the rivers are defined by the forests. So if you stop having the forests, the river flows are changing, floods are increasing. You have great amount of soil erosion because the forests are not there anymore, right? So you basically are in a predicament where the loss of forests are leading to the loss of more forests, right? What is happening as a result of that is that shrinking incomes cause deforestation, cause ecological degradation. And in this map, you'll see that the areas highlighted in pink are in fact the areas that are suffering from high intensities of deforestation today, right? So it is this vicious cycle. And it is important to note here, and I think some people might find this interesting, Trisha, Sunaina especially, is that you see that the deforestation rate in Assam today is low. And that is happening because we've already lost all our forests, right? We have already lost many of our forests. And therefore, this deforestation has now moved to many parts of Meghalaya, Nagaland, the whole Chittagong belt of Bangladesh, northern Myanmar. So the areas where forests exist still. This this problem presents an opportunity, and I think it is good to call it an opportunity because that then gives you the motivation to be able to change something, right? So it is a problem, it is a massive problem, but I think if you look at this problem as an opportunity to find a solution, things become a bit more exciting than they are, yeah, and not dull anymore. So the rural futures model was born out of this opportunity of creating a pathway to restore forests, to manage forests, and to derive livelihoods from these forests, which would lead to the restoration of further forests, right? So it began by trying to answer certain fundamental questions of how do you create payment systems for restoration? How do you add livelihood values for people till the forest grows? Because a forest takes a long time to grow. So a forest is not grown in 2 or 3 years. It takes at least 10 to 30 years, depending on the species, for a forest to grow. So using modes of agriculture that would give people faster cash and would be good for biodiversity, things like agroforestry, right? Creating sustainable businesses which are dependent on the growth of nature and not on the degradation of nature, like growing of mushrooms and weaves and ecological tourism, which is beneficial to nature. And by creating modes of scientifically managing your natural assets, maintaining your natural assets, harvesting fruits, medicines, crops from the forest, and in fact using them to barter in the local economies led to the birth of rural futures. So rural futures, in fact, tries to solve the problems that I talked about earlier. And if you understand that the major problem was poverty, right? So the major problem, poverty was driving deforestation and poverty was driving crimes against wildlife. So community-led habitat restoration was the key focus of rural futures, which required revenue. Communities were paid to restore habitats. But these restored habitats, in fact, gave communities revenue to develop social assets. And when I say social assets, it's access to water, access to energy, healthcare, education. This, alongside with programs to build communities' capacities in managing the forests, led to an enhancement of knowledge and skills, led to a great enhancement of my own knowledge and skills of indigenous knowledge from the communities, and led to the creation of sustainable businesses within these communities that were dependent on nature. And this then drove a positive feedback loop of revenue, which led to more habitat restoration, therefore more revenue, and therefore social assets and sustainable businesses. So this began as a pilot about 4 to 5 years ago, and after being piloted across 6 sites now in Assam and Meghalaya, we know that this model works, and we know that this model is able to restore habitats, and it is able to increase people's incomes by restoring habitats and from the revenue, right? So essentially, we have solved a problem by taking degraded habitats to creating restored habitats and ensuring that people's economic mobility increases in the process. And by economic mobility, I refer to the fact that people now have more cash to spend than before. And when this habitat is restored, the natural capital or the money that you earn from this new forest or from your new farms, in fact, have the ability for you to provide yourself with access to things like schools and education and better housing, right? Which is the aspiration of every community. So the advantages of developing a model or a framework which tackles certain problems or certain holistic problems, and you try and solve problems at the root cause, the advantages are that now we have a system which can predict how much land in this entire region can be restored. So our predictions say that we have about 4.1 million hectares of land to be restored and about 1.8 million hectares of agricultural land to be restored. And by this restoration, by doing upscale modeling of the data that we have today, we can predict that we can create direct employment for about 20 million people. And direct employment for 20 million people means an indirect impact of over 100 million people, which is over half the population of the area. And by doing this, you can also create great revenue through natural capital potential, which is about $122 billion in a year. So you're not only creating a pathway for the restoration of your forests, but you're also creating a pathway by which your forests are leading to economic mobility of communities, right? Which was the problem that we started with. So I think this is a small sort of case study on how you build a framework model to solve a problem, but you use the interdependence of nature and the interdependence of human lives and wildlife and communities and economics to create a pathway which is not only benefiting the forest or not only benefiting people, but is in fact benefiting the entire ecosystem of the region. Yeah. So now, in fact, I mean, this was a talk about involving communities in the Eastern Himalayan belt, but I do know that Trisha has a very great example of communities being most beneficial in a very interesting ecosystem of mangrove forests. So Trisha, I would also love to hear more about that as I happen.
Thanks,
Yes,
Saurav.
Trisha.
But I'm going to spend a couple of minutes before I actually jump into that program that I used to work with. So one of the very important takeaways, again, from everything that Saurav said, and one of the ways that we also approach any new program that we're planning to build, is to take into consideration what are the needs of the local communities. And why is this so essential to a conservation program is because they are your frontline defenders of your forests and your wildlife. They're the people who are living side by side these biodiversity areas, and they're also the people who are most dependent on these biodiverse areas. Um, the way that you approach building a program will be different in any landscape that you look at. So the way we work in Nagaland is very different from the way we'd be working on the western coast. Just to jump into some very successful community conservation models, you can look at Eagle's Nest in Arunachal Pradesh. Then through Habitats Trust funding, Foundation for Ecological Security has been working now for the last 5 years in 3 landscapes of Nagaland, working to develop their community conserved areas, giving them the ownership, giving them the lead to actually create biodiversity registers. They are the ones who decide what are the laws that are applicable and are not applicable in their wild spaces. Similarly, you look at the Western Coast, we've been working with an organization called Sahyadri Nisarg Mitra. And I personally love their program. They went into Ratnagiri, believe it was around 2011 or 2013, to conserve olive ridley turtles on the West Coast. And initially, they were the ones in charge of the program. Today, this program has been completely handed over to the local communities. They are not only conserving the turtles on their own, they have built an entire um, eco-friendly tourism model around it, and it's called the Velas Turtle Festival, which attracts millions of people each year. It's a wonderful thing to see that the communities are taking the lead of conservation. The communities have complete ownership of the programs because this is the only way that any conservation effort can be sustainable in the long run. As conservationists, as people, Saurav's based in Guwahati, I was based in Delhi. We can come in, we can spend time there, but we are not the people who live there full time. They are the ones who must be involved and must be the leaders of any sustainable conservation initiative. So coming to what Saurav was touching upon, I was very, very fortunate to again be managing a program which was running in Sundarbans. And I'm going to very quickly try and share some imagery with you from that landscape. There we go. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Thanks, Saurav. So the first time I went to the Sundarbans was back in 2012 or 13. And I did not understand anything about mangroves there. I did not understand anything about the local community and the way that it was functioning over there. All I had heard was that there's a lot of tiger conflict and there's a lot of poaching, especially through pirates coming in from coming into the mangroves. So I went there kind of understanding what were the key threats, but not understanding the root cause of the problem. So I spent my first few years with WPSI just observing, interacting with the communities, understanding what the problem was. And that's when I realized what a beautiful program WPSI had developed in this landscape. The program, when you look at it at cursory view, seems more like a community support program. It does, let's see, we have a tie-up with ICAR where they were doing duckery, piggery, fishery trainings for the local communities. There were self-help groups where women were being encouraged to revive the kantha stitching and create these beautiful embroidered tiger cushions and stoles, which they were also developing their own microcredit scheme. There were bi-monthly health camps that we were running with doctors that were coming in from Kolkata. There was a kindergarten school that we were running over there, which was providing primary and first grade education to children of the island of Bali Island. What you can't see in this image is on top of the school, we actually also built a cyclone shelter, which came very much in use recently. But this cyclone shelter was a labor of love and took us about 3 years to construct. Apart from that, the team was, of course, working in a very concerted fashion on biodiversity. This is an image of a tiger that had been rescued from a village and was being released back into the protected area. And what's very interesting is that in this we have a team of volunteers who are actually local community members who are there before the forest department arrives for crowd control, and they've specially trained, they've been provided equipment. Again, the local communities are the ones who lead this initiative. Then we have mangrove plantation. So every year, the entire island comes out to plant mangroves together. So that's a few images. And yes, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the team over there in Sundarbans was distributing rations and supplies to the villagers, not only of Bali Island, but also the neighboring Sajnikhali and other marginalized islands. So looking at this program, the first thing that stands out is it's completely community centric. Uh, Sorry, I'm going to stop sharing now. Yeah, it's very community centric. Everything is designed to support the communities, to encourage the communities, to give them livelihoods, to give them primary education, to give them healthcare. How does this translate to wildlife conservation? The amazing thing is, since this program started running, the number of tigers that are being killed in human-wildlife conflict when they stray into villages has dropped drastically, because people see Wildlife Protection Society of India not as somebody who's just there to save the wildlife, but also somebody who's there to support them. And what they're doing is it's a symbiotic relationship. We're supporting you, we're supporting the community, you're supporting us with our interest of conserving wildlife. Similarly, there's been a drastic drop in illegal fishing. So one of the major problems in the Sundarbans were that local fishermen were going into the protected areas in these very rustic boats, and they were being killed by tigers, again adding to the conflict issue, as well as then illegal fishing, which takes away your food for your mangrove species, be it the otter, etc. So even that has reduced. So in these ways, when you're taking the community along with you on your conservation journey, when you make them a key stakeholder in any program that you're building, you're creating a more holistic program, you're creating a symbiotic relationship, and you're creating a model that is far more sustainable than going in and targeting just one issue. You're trying to target the root cause of the problem rather than target the threat. As I said before, when I walked in 2012-13, I understood the threat. I did not understand the root cause of the problem. And that's something very important to keep in mind when you're building the framework of any program, particularly one that involves communities.
It's great. It's great to really understand like the way you guys have conveyed through images, and the way Saurav has presented it in a very animated way. Like it has made us understand the topic more better, and to really understand what you guys do on ground, and just have a picture of what exactly you guys do for the conservation of wildlife. So seeing you both, it's really interesting. It's really exciting to see you both talk about such things, and I'm pretty sure that so many of us are interested in having such a career. So that brings me to the next question. I'm just curious, like everyone is like really curious about the fact that how have you guys have gotten so neck deep into conservation in spite of having diverse educational background? So yeah, we should go ahead with Trisha first.
Okay, all right. Um, I'm going to be very honest. When I graduated, from school, I did not know a lot of people who were working in conservation. So it did not even occur to me that conservation was a viable profession for me to follow. So at that time, I decided I would go in for an BSc in economics and management. It seemed like a safe avenue that left a lot of doors open. While I was doing my BSc in Economics and Management from London School of Economics, it gave me a lot more exposure and got me thinking. So when I came back and it was time for me to start interning and seeing what I wanted to do in what was supposed to be my gap year, I approached a lot of organizations, and I'll be very honest, I had the door shut in my face more times than I can count before finally I joined WWF. And even when I joined WWF, it wasn't where my passion lay, which was on ground initiatives, but rather I joined them in their corporate fundraising and fundraising department. Sorry, just give me one moment. I need to plug in my charger.
Absolutely.
So I worked with them for a while, and I'm very thankful that I began my career working on the management side of things, because that's something I've carried with me throughout. Even to date, I am still working very much on conservation management as much as it is working on ground on conservation. Um, so then I worked with WWF, and eventually I joined Wildlife Protection Society of India back in 2013. That's where I got my first exposure into on-ground initiatives, and that's where I was sold. So I was supposed to go to a master's, but I ended up spending 6 years with WPSI, uh, working on programs from across the country, whether it be Uttarakhand, Odisha, Madhya Pradesh, in Sundarbans. So it was just following my passion more than anything else. It was something that I knew I wanted to do. I saw a need, I saw a lacuna, because there weren't enough people at that point also who saw conservation as a viable career, much like me. And something I keep trying to tell people is 11 years later, now I've been working in conservation for 11 years. I do not regret my decision for a moment. Always follow your passion, and do not be ever deterred by the fact that you may not necessarily have the educational qualifications to go after a certain field. We live in a world where there is the luxury to go back and educate yourself. I hope to go back and do a program which I've been looking at, which I hope to do this summer, which is more of an endangered species recovery program, because that's something I feel like now, after 11 years, I see a lot of value in the work that I've been doing so far, so I can go back and do that. Never limit yourself. And even if you're not working in wildlife conservation, this is not necessarily your primary passion. You want to work in communications, you want to work in IT, you want to work in the n number of fields, any field. You want to be a doctor. If you want to be a doctor, go volunteer with programs like what we were doing in Sundarbans. You can come for health camps. You want to be a communicator, help organizations build effective communication strategies, because a lot of our grassroots organizations in India are doing fabulous work, but they just don't have the communication ability for the larger audience to understand what they're doing. If you're an IT person, especially if you look at your SDGs, let's go back to the SDGs for a second: life on land, life on water. There is so much potential for OTK platforms, for software, for analysis platforms to be implemented into the kind of data collection and on ground surveys and work that's been done. So, what I would say is anyone can be a conservationist and anyone can follow their passion. So, over to you, Saurav.
Yes, Saurav, please. Oh my God, this is really inspiring. Like the way you guys are saying, come on, Saurav, go ahead. Just want to hear it.
So thank you, Trisha. I think my journey was a complete accidental one, kind of like Trisha's, although she didn't use the word accidental. She was trying to be very casual about her accidental work experience with WWF. So I think how it began. I mean, I grew up in the northeast of India. Growing up in the northeast of India, you are exposed to forests very often, and I mean almost on a daily basis back then, and not now. But I don't think that that had any connection with the fact that I went on to study biology and got myself a master's in biology, and I was very interested in the biology of cells and molecular biology, which in fact made me to move to Germany from the UK, where I was studying, to do more research in biology, teaching in biology. And it was actually there that I started volunteering with an organization that used to take school kids aged 5 and 6 for walks into national parks, and it was my job to explain the biology of the forest to them. But I think back then, the only small trigger that I can think of is the fact that most forests in Europe have only 4 types of trees, like across Europe, no matter where you go, because most of those forests have been constructed by humans, and they look like forests that are constructed by humans. So that for me was incredibly boring. Like it was incredibly boring to be in those forests, and I was getting a bit interested in wildlife biology back then. So I decided actually to come back to India, which was about 5 years ago, to do an internship with the Balipara Foundation, and then to go back to a new master's in wildlife biology. And the theme of this internship was to understand the relationships between humans, forests, and wildlife, primarily elephants, and to figure out a way to mitigate the conflict that is happening between humans and elephants, similar to the conflict that Trisha referred to in the Sundarbans between tigers and humans. And in fact, the Rural Futures model developed as a result of that internship, which was meant to be 3 months, but then I sort of like stayed back for another 3 months and another 6 months, and the internship happened for a year, and by then I was neck deep, like you said, into in the forest and into rural futures, that there was no going back. Yeah, and I think while saying this, I still had an apartment in Berlin, which I had sublet to someone, and then I'm like, guys, I don't think I'm coming back. In fact, I still have half my things there because I haven't managed to go back and get everything after 5 years. So I think similar to what Trisha said, I don't have any educational expertise in what I do, but it was that I was trying to find an answer to a problem, and in the process of trying to find that answer, I became so intrigued that I wanted to fight that solution myself, in a way, right? And I think because in tasks, I mean, I don't call this a job, like, it's not a job, like, but in professions like these, it is in fact the gains that you make that sort of keep you going. And I think that for sure in this profession there are more failures than successes, and I think it is how you can in fact make your models and your programs better from these failures and gain those small joys. But it is those small joys for you which have amazing gains for wildlife, amazing gains for forests, right? And I have also, I think, realized the importance of collaboration in the space. So I am not an expert, like I don't have knowledge of wildlife biology, and I don't have knowledge of botany, and I don't know how to build computer programs, but I partner with great people from universities, from other organizations who have all the expertise, right? So I think if you are driven by something that you want to fight or something that you want to solve, no matter what you have studied, works. And in fact, half of my team is built of constitutes of people from the indigenous community who have only graduated from high school, and it is people from these indigenous communities who have taught themselves botany, who have taught themselves biology, who have taught themselves how to use a computer, and who now carry out all the work on the ground, who now identify all the plants in the forest, who now do all of the biodiversity audits. So it is possible to teach yourself to do everything. And I think one of the most beautiful things with which technology has brought upon us is the fact that information is available to everyone. So I can go online now and teach myself something brand new. Like Trisha mentioned that she wanted to learn a bit more about endangered species rescue. I want to teach myself architecture, right? I mean, my next dream is that I want to be an architect who can use indigenous design and create beautiful new houses for indigenous people. But I guess I'll have time to do that in the next 10 years. And I think it really doesn't matter what you study, what your profession is. Even if you are the CEO of a big bad corporate, I will not name any because I don't know who's in the audience, but you can be a CEO of a big bad corporate and still make a difference from the inside, right? I mean, you can be an IS officer and make a big difference. You can be inside a fossil fuel driven organization and make a change. So I think that we need change makers within systems and within institutions that don't work perfectly. So we need people to be doing as many types of courses as possible. and do whatever you want with the passion. And if you have the passion for sustainability and the environment, you will do it anyway, irrespective of whether you don't need to have jobs like Trisha and I to be able to have positive impacts on the environment. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure by now everyone would have started googling like how to become a wildlife conservative person. But
There's no recipe,
so
unfortunately. No recipe at all.
now I would just like to make a small comment here. All the participants, if you have any kind of questions for both of our speakers, you can just put it down in the chat box, and we'll be getting to you soon.
And if you
Okay.
guys don't have questions, then we'll have to ask you questions to kill time. So it
Oh,
makes sense.
I'm sure, guys, you don't want that.
We'll ask all the
So,
questions, Ojas. We'll ask Ojas all the questions. So yeah.
oh
Yeah.
my God, guys.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So that brings me to our last question and the last topic, which is COVID-19. Um, will there be a difference in the way conservation is approached post-COVID? Like, what kind of effects has this pandemic of this proportion uh, has affected your mode of work, and like how are you handling the issues basically? We'll
So
go first with Saurav.
yeah,
Sorry,
so
sorry
in
to interrupt.
fact, thank you for that order because Tisha and I have planned this like a debate. Yeah,
Wow.
we have this debate because we have completely opposing views on this. So
Okay.
I think COVID-19 has been fantastic for the environment. Yeah, it has been fantastic for the environment. It has been terrible for mankind temporarily. Many people have lost lives, which is terrible. But if you look at the global cause of the environment and the global cause of the forest, I think unfortunately we needed something like COVID-19 to bring people's attention to the forests. And unfortunately, humans are very dramatic by nature, right? So you need something as devastating and something as dramatic to wake everybody up and for everyone to actually think about the forests. I don't think that people are doing this because they actually feel it, but I know that many say corporations in the world now have new regulations for deforestation. Many, I mean, there are many global regulations in the EU, in Australia, in Latin America, soon in India, that will have stricter controls on how corporates use land, on how corporates remove forests to create way for, say, palm oil plantations or rubber or tea, and actually have stronger indices for measuring the impact that these large organizations have on land. And therefore, as a result of this, for say people like me, actually me, because Trisha is on the other end giving people money to do work, but like people like me who go and ask people like Trisha for money to run our programs, in fact, I mean, are presented with this great opportunity that there is a lot more incentive in the world now for conservation. So now is the time to actually grab the opportunity, because I don't think that the opportunity will last for too long, because also humans tend to forget things, we tend to forget things very, very fast. So while it's hot, it is a fantastic opportunity for people in the conservation space to reach out to other people, tell people that you want to work on the forest, tell people that you want to restore forest, and there is an opportunity everywhere because it is hot. Now over to you, Trisha, I guess, to kill
Okay.
it.
So no, I'm not going to kill it. um, I do agree with Saurav, and I have to be hopeful that the pandemic will lead to long-term positive changes. However, I am a bit jaded, and I do believe, like Saurav said, the apathy will set back in. The problem I see with the pandemic and the immediate results and immediate action for environment and immediate change in attitudes, it's just not happened. We all of us were sitting at home during the lockdowns, and we believed that it was the best time for wildlife. We were seeing these gorgeous images of civet cats walking around Chandigarh around one traffic station. We saw lovely images of Nilgai in Noida, and all of these imageries. I believe there were some dolphins in Venice that we were looking at. While we were all looking at this, what we did not realize is within our own country, there was a 151% increase in poaching during lockdown. And most of this was for your bushmeat, most of this was for your herbivores, because there was such food insecurity and inavailability across the country. Um, Moreover, patrolling was very limited because you had people who were just locked away from their posts, and and that's when opportunistic poaching takes its shot, and poaching was on a rise. Illegal wildlife trade was on a rise. So that's just what we're talking about during lockdown. While we were looking at gorgeous images, this is what was happening in the background. Going further, in the last few years, we've seen environmental laws being weakened consistently, which is not a very positive thing, especially given that we just talked in the beginning of this entire discussion about how zoonosis are so intrinsically linked with conservation of our forests and restoration of our forests. To be weakening environmental laws right now would be detrimental to that and can potentially be the foundation. Sorry, my electricity is gone, but I hope my internet's still on. It would potentially be the paveway for the next pandemic. Um, Moving even further than that, I mean, what we've also seen is that because there were so many people affected by the pandemic, and because so many people lost their livelihoods and were facing these health crises, understandably so, more and more of funding and investment is now being channeled away from the environment and into health and recovering livelihoods and recovering the economy. So while we hopefully corporate funding can fill that lacuna, but a lot of government funding that used to be there for environment, we're now seeing moving away. So it's a double-edged sword. You can't ignore people causes. You cannot just brush it under the table. We, as conservationists, I'm sure Saurav would agree with me, the first priority is human life. But at the same time, we need to figure out a way that wildlife conservation, sustainability, biodiversity conservation can go hand in hand with what we're doing for human beings. And I don't think we're close to striking that balance yet, but I'm very hopeful that your generation and the generations that come after you, they're much more environmentally aware, they're much more conscious, they're conscious consumers, and that's going to be the ultimate change.
And I think just to add a bit to that, I think Trisha, that the one very important perspective here is that of the kinds of migration that happened during COVID, right? So because I am from the northeast of India, we saw a lot of inbound migration of many of the local youth who travel to Bombay, Bangalore to get really horrible jobs, right? Usually. And they do this because there are no jobs available here. And now many of these people are back. A few have already gone back to the horrible jobs that they had before, but many of them are still here, you know. So in fact, today is the opportunity to be able to create good jobs for them. And when I mean good jobs, I don't mean setting up a Patanjali factory and, you know, selling stuff everywhere in the country, but rather setting up something which is dependent on the growth of the forest and local industries and organic products. And there is a market for it, right? So this is the time when we need to be able to collectively drive investments into rural areas, because if it is not for the rural areas and the economy is there, we wouldn't have food. I mean, Bombay doesn't really grow its food, right, guys? I mean, where does your food come from? So, yeah, yeah, yeah.
All right. So now we have a question coming in from Arpita. Yes, Arpita. You can unmute and go ahead.
Hi, morning everyone. Sorry, it's morning in this part of the world. Can you hear
Oh,
me?
wow.
Yes, Arpita.
Yes, yes,
Hi.
absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. Actually, I got this invite from one of your attendees and professor in the institute, Sunaina Sarkar, my childhood friend. So she invited me to join, and
Yeah.
it's 7 a.m., 7:30 a.m. here. I woke, so it's a
Oh,
little
wow.
bit of time. I missed the first part because I went running.
Thank you
So
for waking up so early.
Yeah.
Very nice.
yeah. Well, I'm starting teaching in a half an hour, but it's very
Yeah.
interesting to see what she's been doing, and I'm following her page, and through that, I got introduced to the kind of work you guys are doing. Talking about conservation, I am teaching in the Caribbean, and where I am based now in Jamaica, the problem of deforestation is there. We do, and one thing I find similarity with India is I'm from India. All my life, I've lived 30 years there, is the implementation of the policies and the plans. And this is what we keep saying. There's a lot of research. There are a lot of NGOs who are working, government organizations, but how sustainable are these plans for long-term conservation? So we have a project for 5 years. That's the agenda of the funding institution. It works for 5 years. And then another agenda comes up for the government. This is what I'm seeing here. I don't know if the same thing happens in India. So maybe I'm wrong, but this
No, the
is
same.
what happens. Yeah.
Yeah.
And COVID-19 and food security was a research topic yesterday. A student presented, and it's the same thing. People are moving to the cities in Kingston from the forested areas because of job. And you cannot tell them that go back and live in those environments because they are building on slopes which are not supposed to be there. So there are squatter communities and they are just, and who checks on these things? That is also, yes, we have National Trust, we have a World Heritage Zone. So all is fine in that buffer zone. But again, a lot goes missing. So that is just something I found connected hearing to your talk, Saurav and Trisha's. I think India is a big country. There's more complications and problems than in a small island over here. But something interesting to keep connected. Thank you, Sunena.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much.
Thank you so
And
much.
yes, a very good point you brought up about sustainability and conservation. So perhaps if this talk is available somewhere, both Saurav and I were talking about how sustainability, the way forward would be to hand over ownership of programs to communities.
Yeah. And I mean, you brought out an important topic about, projects beginning and ending, and then a whole brand new idea coming in the minds of governments or corporations. And I think that is also one of the reasons why many conservation organizations in the field boom and cease to exist, because I think if you are driven by a need, by trying to fix a problem, using a model, using a framework, using an innovation, then that is what drives you, right? And the people who support your work support your innovation. If you are driven by a project grant that you get from donor X, and therefore you do the work, and then a grant that you get from donor Y, then you will be controlled and you will flow based on the grants that you get from the donors or from governments or from corporations. Which is why I think, going back to the first presentation that I made, it is important to understand the problem, it is important to feel the problem, and it is important to driven by the passion of trying to solve that problem holistically. And
Saurav, you've muted yourself.
Okay, sorry. No, so I was just saying that you will find people to join your journey if you're driven by passion. Yeah, yeah, that was that. Oh, just over to you.
All right. I have a question from my side. So I've heard this term known as national park volunteering. Would you like just tell something about it, like anything that comes to your mind? Because I was looking forward to visiting such national park, but then I got this thing where they were like asking some volunteers to come and work for the national parks. How does that thing work, if you have any idea?
I think both Saurav and I are Googling this right now because, as far as I know, this concept is there in America and some of the Western countries, but I do not believe we have national park volunteering in India. But if you are interested in volunteering, between Saurav and me, I'm sure we can put together a nice long laundry list of organizations that could really use the help on ground.
Yeah, yeah. And I would also recommend here to do volunteering towards a passion that you want to fix, and not just to a national park, because I think national parks are just constructs that we've built over the last 100 years for ourselves, right? I mean, national parks. I think we can have an entirely other webinar on whether we need them or not, or to what extent. But I think, yeah, I mean, if you want to volunteer, you can always contact us. And I mean, I also know that, I mean, both Anish and Bit2 also run fantastic volunteering programs. So yeah, you can reach out to any of us, give us a call, drop us an email, and we'll be happy to help you. And I think your very own Professor Sunena here, And I think Arshita is also here. I think both of them will also be able to guide you very well.
With help from both of you, of course.
Sure, sure. Yeah.
Okay.
I have a
If there's
question
one, yeah, ma'am.
uh,
Go ahead.
to both of you. It is about getting a grant for doing any kind of work which is related to conservation. How difficult is it? Can our students, in spite of doing their, pursuing their own careers, their own programs, can they also kind of, get into it? And, if they want to, what are the ways of going about it? What are the any tips that you all can give us? Because we have a lot of very very enthusiastic students who, in spite of doing something, say like mechanical engineering, would want to use the kind of things that they are learning and try and channelize it into a conservation effort. So if you could help us out as to what kind of things that they should look out for, or if there are any kind of opportunities for them here in India at least.
Sir, you want me to tackle this one?
Yeah, you go first, and then I'll fill gaps if any. Yeah, you're the expert.
Yes, there are grants available out there. There are small grants available from Rafford. There's small grants available from WWF India, as well as within THT, we do offer an individual grant for any individual who's not a full-time member of an NGO or on the board. What are things to keep in mind when you're applying for a grant? Firstly, is your problem statement. How strong is the problem statement that you're looking at? What is your sustainability plan? Because when you're looking at a grant, as we've covered over and over again through the course of this discussion, it's usually anywhere between 1 to 5 years that you're going to be funded by an organization. But what any grant giving organization wants to see is how you're going to sustain that work in the long run. What is your capacity to build upon that, build upon the seed funding that you're being provided? Another very important thing, of course, is to look at the expected conservation impact on ground. There's a lot of proposals that we at least receive at the Habitats Trust, which are wholly directed only towards research. What's very important is to make that research public so that it's actionable and usable. So Sunaina, you touched upon technology and whether people want to apply for grants for technology. I would say rather than applying for grants for technology, there are so many organizations that actually have some amount of funding available to develop their technology and that the implementation of tech on ground. Citizen science is one of the platforms that has just been exploding in the last 5 years. Just looking at some of the projects we fund, there is the River Watch project, which is being managed by one of our partners called Niti Mahesh, which is monitoring the Kaveri River. Then there is Frog Watch, which is an application where any citizen from any part of the world can actually upload pictures of frogs, and it's actually doing a biodiversity map, understanding the threats, understanding population distributions. So there are many. If you're looking at tech, I would say don't apply for a grant yourself unless you're going to be doing this full time. Rather partner with an organization, collaborate with an organization that already has a problem statement, that already has the capacity to implement that technology on a wide scale, and to understand the real pros and cons of that tech so that it can be improved. If you're looking to apply for a grant for a project on ground where you're running a conservation project, building it from the ground up, absolutely there are grants available. It's not easy to get because there are a lot of individuals who are competing for those few grants that are available. But yeah, there are a lot of resources and guidance available online as well, apart from Saurav and myself as resources available to you to help you with that.
Yeah. And I think I just like to add that I think Trisha covered everything because she really, as I mentioned earlier, is the person that people go to for money and for grants. But I think the one really important toolkit that I have learned from the development sector, and I'm emphasizing on this because I am not from the sector, is being able to construct your theory of change. So Trisha mentioned a problem statement and outcomes. But if you have a problem that you want to tackle and you can justify the measures that you want to take to tackle that problem, if you can justify the direct outputs of these measures on land, on programs, on research, if you can convince people of what the larger outcomes and impacts of these problems will be, I think it is possible, and I think that it is more and more possible now in India. Sunaina and I have been discussing a few, and in fact, Sunaina is a great person to find these things online. Like she's a
She
treasure,
is. She is.
treasure trove of say information. Yeah, so I think it is
I shall
possible, and
bask in that glory.
and I think I mean it will be very interesting to have students and faculty, because unfortunately students only will not be allowed to apply for most of the grants, even research grants, but like students and faculty together applying for research grants will be creating something really new and exciting, and I think something also much more meaningful as an outcome for the students. And I would also recommend, like Trisha said, students, faculty partnering with organizations whose visions and passions you believe in and you want to contribute towards, because you have the skills that many other people don't, you know.
We have another question from Arpita.
No, it's not a
Yeah.
question. I find similarities in topics being discussed there and here. This collaborative work is very important, but sometimes the translation of the science into layman term is what throws off people from collaborating, because I have been told, honestly, I can't write in layman terms. Now, how layman can you go down? So if the river is contaminated, it's going to affect your water quality, straightforward. But when you put it to a politician that you want to say that, okay, we've monitored the Godavari River for 5 years and these are the contaminants. So the way it gets translated to a politician and to a scientist, sometimes the language kind of throws us off from getting further funds. It may not be very interesting. Well, you answered most of the questions Sunena had on collaborative projects, and it's interesting. And I'll speak with her. There are quite a few platforms I know where I've seen people presenting on conservation work done from India through landslide or flood risk or ecosystem management. So maybe I'll share so you can also present. There is a conference which is happening online again this year in September. It's the Institute of Sustainable Development. Delhi, in India, there is a branch in Delhi, ICSD, International Center for Sustainable Development. So they have a lot of topics on where you guys can maybe present your work or what you're doing with Sunena and other colleagues in this platform. There's some suggestions. I can share with Sunena these informations. And I'm on Facebook all over, so I'll share, tag her. That's all.
And in
Thanks for
fact,
that,
That's
Arpita.
great.
Arpita, it is amazing the outcomes that you see from involving citizens in doing the science and involving communities in science, and the way that citizen science demystifies some things that seem very complicated have at least been amazing to me, right? Because I can also personally not do that, because I am a scientist at heart, but slowly becoming a development professional, as they call it. But but I think citizen sciences can provide some fantastic outcomes for the public. Yeah. Also in terms of the way you
And it's
communicate.
needed. These projects which we academics do, especially on environment, it is, if you do everything on science base, it doesn't reach out to the community, right?
Yeah.
So I can say, okay, don't deforest this area, but it may be a farmland for a small farmer. They may want to build some infrastructure. So you have to go down to the communities, and that I learned that being too scientific will not get, truth be told, it will not get you funding. So you will have to go down to community level, transfer your knowledge to them in simple words that, hey, if you are going to be cutting down these X number of trees, you're going to cause landslides downstream, and which will affect X number of farms, and which will affect food security. So the whole thing has to be understood by them in simple words, because talking to farmers, they will say, so how do I get impacted? I mean, yes, you're saying don't plant, don't do this and that. How does my farmland get affected from climate change? So there's a lot of work which we can do combined, but we are all limited with time and resources.
Thank you so much,
Good work
Arpita.
indeed. And thanks to Sunana again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
We have
Arpita, for
Kushal
joining
Gupta
in
here.
across the seas. I think we have another question from Ojas. Can you see?
Yes, it's from Kushal Gupta. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I am a student of Dr. Sunena, and it is my honor to be asking you a question. So, my question is towards Trisha, ma'am. Ma'am, do you think that the coronavirus pandemic, as a zoonotic disease, it has restored the imbalance which this world has been facing? Because there is a lot of population imbalance. This planet cannot hold more than 8 billion people. So do you think that this is valid from an ecological point of view?
So Saura's smiling because you've really put me in the hot seat over there. But no, I would not think that this was necessary to restore the balance. I believe awareness, education, sustainable consumption, actually only consuming what you need, limiting your demands, being a more conscious consumer. There were a million other ways we should have been doing this. At the same time, there is a part of me that believes that this pandemic is not the worst that we've seen if we do not improve our relationship with our natural environment. Right now we're consuming natural resources faster than the world can replenish it, and as much as that's linked to population, that is mostly linked to greed. We are very wasteful. Human beings can be extremely wasteful. So it's really about making conscious choices and only consuming what you need. That's the way forward. We do not need a pandemic to wipe out populations. That's not the answer. It's being more conscious in our everyday lives. That's the way forward.
Thank you very
Thank you
much,
so
ma'am.
much, Kushal. So now I'll just summarize the whole session. So starting with SDGs being important goals are basically interconnecting and interconnected and are important for wildlife conservation. Various organizations are driven with wildlife conservation but are lacking behind in communication with large crowds in the country. Um, Also, most importantly, local communities being an important part for economic mobility, for rural areas, as well as wildlife or human interactions. So now I would like to thank you so much for your time, Trisha and Saurav. It's been great 45 minutes. I don't even know what the time is. So I feel honored to be a part of this panel of discussion, and I'm looking forward to having you guys the next year with the Earth Appreciation Society.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us here, Ojas. Thank you, Sunena, for inviting me, and Saurav, I think, for suggesting me for this. It's been such a lovely interaction with all of you, and I love some of the questions. I love interactive sessions because they get you thinking. As a conservationist, when you're working in a very small field and you're meeting the same people over and over again, a lot of your views start to align and you start to think very similarly. So it's always great to speak to people who are from other walks of life and are doing other things because it really gets your brain ticking. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you,
Thank you
everyone.
so
Thank you
much,
so much.
Trisha.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Next
so
time,
much, Trisha
we'll
and
be
Saurav.
asking Ojas all those questions that we didn't have time
Yeah.
for.
Definitely, sir. Definitely, I'll do my homework.
Well,
Uh,
Thank you
it
so
was
much, guys.
really nice having both of you on board because, we are predominantly a student group here that is attending the seminar. And for them to be able to see you all and, get sensitized to a lot of the issues that we need to get them sensitized for, it has been much easier. And because both of you had so much to share, it was an amazing session to sit with you all and listen to all that you had to say.